We're the America First conservatives. And that means that there's no foreign aid to Israel. And that means that we know who's running the media. And that means that we care about demographics. Think of the potential there if we co-opt symbols that are already in use. I think that's by far and away the better take. And maybe not even conservatives, but call yourself a nationalist. Call yourself a nationalist conservative.
Since the advent of the Trump presidency and its aftermath, there's been quite a bit of talk about American nationalism, or what Steve Bannon calls nationalist populism for America. Yet what does nationalism in the American context even mean? Granted, it has a better ring to it than the anemic conservative label forwarded by Con Inc. So far, conservatism, so-called, has only managed to conserve foreign aid to Israel and the American state's relationship to defense contractors. But in order to have nationalism or a nation-state, one needs a nation, meaning a distinct people group or ethnicity with their own identity and at least a somewhat common heritage. With this in mind, I think we can begin to see where the term American nationalism runs into problems. If we look at the European continent, we see a great many nation-states, most of which are dominated by a single ethnic group. For example, in 2011, Serbia was a state which was 83.3% Serbian, with the next largest group, Hungarians, making up 3.5% of the population. A 2016 microcensus of Hungary found that 98.3% of the population was Hungarian. The 2011 census of Poland found that 98% of the population were ethnic Poles. In 2018, Portugal's population was 95.3% ethnic Portuguese. These are proper nation-states, or ethno-states if you prefer, which are culturally and linguistically dominated by one nation, one ethnic group, above all others. Regardless of how you feel about nationalism, whether you're for it or against it for reactionary or progressive reasons, you can understand the logic of such a socio-political phenomenon. An identifiable group, with oftentimes ancient lineage, sees it in their group interest to band together and create a state where they can conduct their own affairs, seek their own national destiny and self-determination apart from the influence or interference of other groups whose customs are foreign and whose values may be alien or even hostile to theirs. As stated before, nationalities often have ancient roots, but they can also be a relatively new ethnos. There are two good examples of recent ethnogenesis in the country I currently live in, the Afrikaners and the Coloreds. I think their histories are illustrative for the purposes of analyzing the concept of American nationalism. Both groups are included for this video for different reasons. The Afrikaners represent the ethnogenesis of a people who bear major similarities to their ancestors, while rightfully viewing themselves as culturally and linguistically distinct from them. The Coloreds are an example of an entirely new ethnicity, representing a cultural break with what came before. The relevance of examining both these groups is that they can help Westerners understand the extent to which an American nation has or has failed to materialize. The Afrikaners are a people who developed in South Africa of largely Dutch origin. The first permanent European settlers to South Africa were Dutch traders who settled the Cape of Good Hope but would later be joined by a contingent of French Huguenots. These French Huguenots would mix with the Dutch, and today you will find both French and Dutch surnames commonly among the Afrikaners, such as Leroux, Cronje, Engelbrecht, Van Zyl, and many others. Smaller groups of Germans and still others would also join the ranks of those who would become the Afrikaners as well. One of the major things that would eventually unite them was language, with all of them eventually leaving the tongue of their country of origin and adopting first Dutch and then Afrikaans, a language similar to older Dutch of the 18th century, but somewhat isolated from the linguistic developments of the Netherlands, and making use of borrowed words as well. They were also all almost universally Calvinists, eventually founding the NG Kerk, or the Dutch Reformed Church of South Africa. As one might expect with a frontier people, the majority of them became farmers, or boers, and through this mixture of linguistic unity, spiritual unity, and interbreeding among these different European ethnicities, they became the Afrikaners that exist today. National consciousness for the Afrikaners, like many groups, was founded partially, though, through adversity, with many Afrikaners fleeing to what is now Gauteng, and the Free State to establish the Boer republics away from the British influence in the Cape Colony, which had been taken over by the British Empire some time before. The frontier experience of coming into contact with various Bantu tribes, fighting and trading with them, venturing into the wilderness to build independent polities that reflected their own vision of society, and ultimately having these ripped away by the British during the Second Anglo-Boer War, helped firmly solidify a national consciousness in the Boer people of South Africa. Developing alongside the Boers and related to both them and the indigenous people of South Africa are the Coloreds. The Coloreds are the largest ethnic or racial group in the Western Cape province of South Africa, and the second largest racial group after blacks. Their lineage is primarily a mix between the early Dutch settlers and later European arrivals with the indigenous Khoisan people of South Africa. The Khoisan themselves are the original inhabitants of what is now South Africa, though they were largely displaced to the Western Cape and Kalahari Desert by southern Bantu migration from Central Africa. Around the city of Cape Town in particular, the genetic lineage of the Coloreds would be further complicated with the arrival of Malaysians brought over by the British Empire as slaves or indentured servants, who would intermarry with the colored population. As a result, there are to this day many Muslim Coloreds in and around Cape Town, though most Coloreds both there and across South Africa are Christians of various denominations. Due to their shared language, ancestry, and other significant cultural similarities, the Muslim and Christian colored communities engage in a great deal of intermingling. They often live right next to each other and have managed a harmonious interfaith coexistence, perhaps unique between Christians and Muslims. The Malaysian influence would also have a huge impact on the cuisine of colored people across South Africa, with curry being ubiquitous, in addition to having a minor effect on the development of Afrikaans through the use of borrowed words. The Coloreds also played a major, perhaps chief role in transitioning Dutch into Afrikaans, or Kitchen Dutch as it was known in earlier times. Many of them would also join the Boers on their great trek to the interior and set up their own independent republics as well, of Griqualand East and West, before being absorbed by the British Empire. Culturally, these people also fill a peculiar niche in South African society. Coloreds have never been culturally Bantu, been identified, nor self-identified as black, despite being outside the Afrikaner or Anglo-South African ethnic groups. They remain culturally closest to them, particularly the former, due to their shared home language, religion, and a sizable chunk of their genetic ancestry. An analogous relationship may perhaps be found in Mexico between the Spanish and Mestizo Americans. Coloreds, too, have developed their identity partially through adversity, as the Afrikaners, though of a different manner. The saying goes that Coloreds weren't white enough during apartheid and aren't black enough today to ever feel represented by either government. Indeed, in their history in South Africa, they've always tended to hold a position as outcasts in both the new and old regimes. They see themselves as a culturally distinct ethnic group within South Africa, like the Afrikaners with ties to the land, and both peoples serve illustrative examples of ethnogenesis. While there are distinct nations within South Africa, there's no true South African identity. Likewise, the prospect of finding an authentic Pan-American identity is also dubious. Early core American colonial stock comes from British Protestant colonists. This WASP core of America played a key role in crafting America's institutions and culture, yet even this was complicated by significant cultural split between Northerners and Southerners. Indeed, these two populations largely came from different parts of England, with Southerners having roots in Northern Ireland and the border regions of Northern England, with Yankees coming from more southern and central parts of England. While both Northerners and Southerners were majority Protestant, the type of Protestantism varied quite a bit, with Northerners often being Puritans, Quakers, Congregationalists, or even Unitarians. The regional, cultural, and linguistic split between Northerners and Southerners, while it still exists, used to be very evident in the past in both attitude and custom. The result were people who, while uniquely a type of American, identified with their home states above some sort of abstract American identity. This was further complicated with the mass immigration the United States experienced in the 19th and 20th centuries. Millions of German, Irish, Italians, and many others would come to people the United States, diluting the two major strands of WASP stock in the country. Given enough time, intermingling, and provided immigration be halted once the land had been peopled, there's a possibility a type of pan-American ethnogenesis may have occurred to a certain extent, but with still a probable large north-south divide in the absence of Yankee imperialism, at least. However, this process of a pan-American ethnogenesis was interrupted and never really took place. The result of all the mass immigration to the United States, particularly after the 1965 Hart-Celler Act, was the creation of a multitude of hyphenated Americans, with each group seeing itself as distinct from the early colonial American stock. This phenomenon of hyphenated Americans existed and still persists in the United States, irrespective of continental origin. Two prominent European examples are the Irish and Italian Americans, who maintained an identity apart from WASPs. This is even more pronounced with Latinos, Africans, and Asians, to say nothing of the indigenous people of the United States, who have certainly never felt part of some grand American identity. What this has resulted in is a largely deracinated country of divergent communities who wouldn't feel at home in the old country, so to speak, but can't identify with the two traditional northern or southern WASP cultures of the United States. In a multinational country with no clearly dominant cultural identity, the only functional basis on which people can differentiate themselves is race. Race in America serves as a gross proxy for genuine culture in the United States, with white America being juxtaposed against whatever minority is being spotlighted at the moment. There's no talk of heritage American culture, Southern identity, or ever a distinction made in American media between a conservative, rural Cajun and a progressive American living in Portland. The Cajun and Portlander are just white, and thus defined as not being minorities, rather than what they actually are, which are two very culturally divergent people of distinct ethnic heritage. As a result, it's no accident that America is probably the most racialized society in the West, and due to its influence and political skullduggery, has been busy exporting this racialism internationally. America started out as a confederation before becoming a federal republic, essentially through a coup of its elites. Then it transformed into an empire after the war between the states, and has since been evolving into a progressive, managerial, therapeutic state ever since FDR, sometimes slowly and sometimes at a breakneck pace. All the while, of course, it's masqueraded as if it was still 1787 and the ink on the U.S. Constitution still wet. If the American empire isn't a nation and can't really appeal to nationalism or a shared culture in any coherent sense, the ejected right-wingers from Conservatism, Inc. and disillusioned reformed progressives are going to have to find something else for a rightist American movement to galvanize behind. This has been Mr. Patriarch. Thanks a lot for stopping by. The show's grown quite a bit in the past few months, with this channel now being monetized on YouTube. I want to thank all of you for helping grow this channel, and I am glad many of you are finding value in my material. If you want to support the show directly, please consider becoming a patron on Subscribestar. It will really help me make more material here or buy my lad some diapers, and I've also got some goodies for you guys over there as well. I'm of course grateful for any support you're willing to give, and I look forward to seeing you again soon. Patriarch, out.